The race is on, and Cadillac's Formula One debut is fast approaching, but just how ready is the startup team, and what can we expect from it in its first season? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to explore what will be one of the big stories of 2026 are Ben Anderson and special guest Sahil Kapur. And we'll also hear from Cadillac team principal Graeme Lowdon. Well, it's always great to welcome a new special guest to the show, and I'm delighted to welcome Sahil Kapur. Now, you are NBC News senior national political reporter in the United States, so it's probably worth you explaining what might be called your sideline in Formula One, and therefore why you're here.
Yeah, it's great to join you. I'm a longtime listener, first-time guest. I have been covering national politics, Congress, and elections in the U.S. for NBC for about a decade and a half now since graduating college. But for the last 3 years, I've also been covering F1. I got my bosses and my editors to recognize that there is somewhat of a growing fan base for F1 in the U.S. And I've been into this sport since I was 9 years old. My first season was watching Michael Schumacher crash into Jacques Villeneuve for the championship race back in, I think it was 1997. So yeah, I guess that's my background. And I've been going to a bunch of races. I've seen you guys there. I usually do the North American ones.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. But yeah, a genuine Capitol Hill US political reporter. So very, very serious business. F1 probably seems slightly trivial in comparison, but I don't know.
Much more fun.
Yeah, very, very much so. Although perhaps the seriousness has been inverted in recent times, but won't ask you to talk about any of that. And Ben Anderson also here,
Hello.
a little bit more regular, no political credentials to speak of. So you are fresh from standing in for me in Austria, though.
Well, not literally standing in for you because I didn't go to the Styrian Hills, but yes, I did. While you were too lazy to go to Austria, I did pick up a piece of your work and compiled the ever controversial driver rankings, which I finished actually not long before joining this podcast. So yeah, a bit of a frantic day.
Yeah, all wrong, of course, the rankings. When I don't do them, they're all terrible. But anyway, yeah, it's good to have a bit of a view from half a step away from the race weekend. But yeah, I'll be heading to Silverstone shortly. But let's get into it. As I say, we're going to talk all about the new Cadillac Formula One team. So, Sahil, the entry process for this team, it lasted an astonishing 764 days. There were some really, really big battles going on in the background before F1 actually relented and let Cadillac in as the 11th team. Now, you were all over that side of things because of the crossover with your day job. So can you tell us a little bit about the role played by that investigation on the US side that people will have heard a little about?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me take you back to 2024. It was early May. I was in the Capitol, which is where I work on a day-to-day basis. That's where my office is. And I was told that, hey, Mario Andretti is going to be outside doing a press conference with a bunch of members of Congress. I'm like, why is Mario Andretti coming to the Capitol? Okay, of course I'm going to go because it was related to F1 and Andretti's attempt to enter the sport. So what happened was there was about a dozen lawmakers there standing next to Mario Andretti. And by the way, this was led by a congressman named John James from Michigan, the district where GM is based. And he starts, the cameras turn on. He starts just trashing FOM and Liberty Media, all the accusations. You're keeping Andretti out. You don't want an American competitor. This is an antitrust violation. This is not acceptable. We will fight this. And then one after another, they echoed him. And, Mario was a little bit more subdued, as you can imagine, but he did make clear that he thought what was happening, what FOM was doing was unfair. This was just a few months, of course, after FOM had rejected that Andretti bid, said they weren't ready for the 2026 entry. And then from there, it snowballed. You have letters, a number of other lawmakers writing letters. I went on TV to report that later. I wrote an article for NBC, and then I started hearing from more congressional offices about it after that happened. Soon, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, a guy named Jim Jordan, who I've covered for a while, opened an investigation into Liberty Media over this. And that's how you knew it was serious, because that guy has subpoena power. It's not just, lawmakers making noise. And then what happened is senators, led by Amy Klobuchar, who sits on the Judiciary Committee, sent a letter to the Justice Department saying, you need to open an investigation into Liberty Media over this. A number of senators, including the Michigan senators, by the way. And just to give you a little context, Michigan is a crucially important swing state. Most of our presidents who want to get elected have to win Michigan to get elected. So that state punches above its weight. Anyway, a few months later, the Justice Department opens that investigation. They don't confirm anything, by the way. The DOJ doesn't confirm anything, but Liberty Media did confirm that. And then the rest is history. You all know what happened. They come up with a deal, whether it's a face-saving mechanism. FOM will deny to this day that the investigation had anything to do with it. But at the end of the day, with some changes, with it being called Cadillac and not Andretti, they got what they wanted. They were admitted to the sport. Now, the underlying context here as well is that Liberty Media has run in with the Justice Department before. They own Ticketmaster, which was sued for a similar antitrust violation. So they're on the Justice Department's list. And if you want to be, a big company operating in the U.S., you don't want to get on the Justice Department's bad side, because there already is a national debate going on here about how aggressively antitrust laws are enforced. Many want them to be more aggressively enforced. So it was just a situation where it really wasn't good for them that this kept going. And well, whatever the reason, they found a way to avoid it, to resolve it.
Yeah, I think in the end it was a little bit of extra payments to the existing teams and reluctantly almost letting the team in. But it does show, Ben, doesn't it, how much of a battle this was. This is actually something we can probably give credit to Mohammed Ben Sulayem for. All those who want there to be an 11th team, if FIA hadn't opened that process and started this whole thing that ultimately forced FOM's hand, because there was this wider political concern, we would have 10 teams next year. There would not be this 11th team.
No, that was always the kind of thing that was hanging over the whole process, right? When Ben Sulayem sort of unilaterally announced the process for an application, everyone was like, well, yeah, but it looks a bit like FIA posturing. Relations between FIA on the regulatory side and FOM on the commercial side weren't great, and they haven't really been at all under his presidency, although I'd say it's a bit calmer now. And it didn't really look that serious. And we always had this feeling that, well, even if this process runs its course, which it did, and it always felt like maybe he was angling to get Andretti in because there were other bidders, right? There were some other applications lodged that were dismissed as not serious enough, but this one was carried forward. We always felt, well, it's going to reach this commercial stumbling block because the 10 teams and FOM were more closely aligned and were always singing from this same hymn sheet of, oh, yeah, but if we let someone in, the commercial pie can't be divided into enough pieces to accommodate all the teams. There are some teams that, like your Williamses and whatnot, who are, and Haas, who've, survived through COVID years, have almost gone to the wall. I mean, even bigger teams like McLaren were taking, loans and whatnot to survive in that period. We're not healthy enough to sustain this, blah, 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 blah. And it always felt, whatever argument they made, regardless of, American politics and law, it looked anti-competitive just from a pure sporting point of view. You were basically saying, well, this is the pinnacle of motorsport, open competition, and we're not prepared to accept another competitor coming in, even though it's permitted within the rules. And that never seemed like an argument that would stand the test of time. And when they rejected them, you thought, well, amazingly, that they're going to stand behind this. They're going to say, right, this is a franchise sport now, and we're not having an 11th team. But I think probably fortunately from the fans' point of view and just the sheer excitement of having a new team in Formula One, American politics and American law managed to force the issue.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. They were always confident that they get this place even during the uncertainty, to the point where a serious amount of money was being thrown into it. And of course, even though they were pretty confident, that's always a slightly uncertain position to be in when you're spending 764 days, as I say, not being 100% sure and putting in huge sums of money. So how big a deal was this in the US? I mean, as you say, you were doing some stories for NBC on it, fighting the good fight for F1 in the US. Was it much of a talking point in the USA in terms of getting penetration in the wider kind of discourse about sports and Formula One?
Certainly in the F1 world, obviously in the racing world, definitely this had broken through to, I think, the IndyCar world as well, because there was always talk about, maybe if Andretti got in, it would try to pluck a driver from IndyCar, which maybe they still will, but I think that talk is cooled. I think we'll get to that later. But beyond that, I think what it was largely driven by was that Andretti is a brand in the US. I think it's very well known to American fans, much more so than Haas, for instance, the other American team. So from that standpoint, I think it did break through to the conversation. But again, the fan base is very fluid. The whole point, one of the reasons that this is going to be such a big deal is that if you have a big name entering F1, like, Andretti building the cars, but it's obviously going to be named Cadillac, backed by GM. Every American knows Cadillac. Every American knows GM. any racing fan in the US has heard of Andretti before. So I think that's the promise of it. Now, do the machinations, the behind the scenes stuff, and what's going on with the FIA and FOM, and maybe the investigations break through? Not so much, but we did do some stories on it, both digitally and on the air, and there was real interest. There was also a debate that it sparked among experts as to whether Liberty Media was in fact what the parameters were. Liberty Media had to prove that it was keeping Andretti and GM out for good business reasons. That if it was personal, as Mario Andretti suggested at one point it was, they had this famous clash, this run-in at the Miami Grand Prix last year at a breakfast, at a VIP reception where Greg Maffei at the time, who was running it, said some words to Mario Andretti, which caught the attention of members of Congress, because that sounded, according to Andretti's recollection, like it was personal. So there was a lot of this going on behind the scenes. Again, how much this breaks through to the ordinary person, I'm still skeptical, but after the entry of the sport, that will change, or after the entry of this team, that'll change.
It feels like there was a personal element to it. I remember doing maybe it's reading into it too much, but I remember doing a media briefing in August, trying to get the years right, 23 it must have been, when with Stefano Domenicali, and he was asked about Andretti and how they'd gone about the process, and he basically said in not so many words that they'd put people's noses out of joint, that they'd kind of talked too much about what they were doing and kind of assumed that they were getting in, not really worked that well with the existing teams to kind of smooth the path. And it always felt like one of the mechanisms for getting the team in was to kind of remove the Andretti element because of that. And I also wonder what would have happened in the parallel universe where the Andretti deal to buy Sauber before Audi swooped in had actually gone through, because we surely wouldn't be discussing 11th team at all. Andretti would already be in, or would they have found some way to have messed that up?
Yeah, that was a consequence of talking too much. That was the reason Finn Rousing pulled the deal, because it got out there and they weren't very happy with that. So, yeah, the moving the Michael Andretti side over was an important part of this. And obviously various things have gone on in terms of, obviously Mario Andretti still on the board, but it's now a slightly different, well, a very different team to the one that came in, because it's a GM team. It'll use the Cadillac brand. TWG run it, TWG Motorsport, which is a subsidiary of TWG Global, which is a very big company, got all sorts of interest in the financial world, sports entertainment. So, yeah, quite a bit of money and know-how there, but they took over and full control of Andretti Autosport as well. So that's how that all came together. So that's what this team is made up of. But yeah, if they bought Sauber, it'd have been a lot simpler. But as it is, we've got this startup team. And one of the reasons we're talking about it now is because I've had the chance to have a bit of a glimpse about what they're doing, because a big part of their strategy was just to quieten down. They got Graeme Lowdon initially in as a consultant, and he knows how the game's played. And he hasn't talked about this, but I imagine part of the agenda there was, look, just keep quiet. We go silent. We play by the rules. We prepare any legal stuff in the background, because there was European legal antitrust stuff potentially as well. So there are a lot of avenues. So they just keep quiet and just do what we do, work away in the background, and we'll eventually get the spot. So it's a really interesting team, though, because it is a startup. They've got a base at Silverstone, which I've been around. It's still in progress, currently in 6 buildings. It will come down to 4, which will be a production hub, a technical centre, a logistics centre, and then a small machine shop. But it's sort of a bit hand-to-mouth at the moment in terms of where everything is. They're still working on building all of that up. They've got this new facility, which is the TWG Motorsport facility, that's being built in Fishers, which is kind of a little city sort of attached to the north of Indianapolis. So that's in progress. A load of production's going to be in there.
Is that the HQ that Andretti was originally going to do when they announced their big Sauber takeover?
Yeah. I think it's kind of an expansion of that project, I believe, certainly in the same place. And then there's a couple of GM technical centres in Warren, Michigan, and there's one in Charlotte, North Carolina as well. The Charlotte one's going to have they're building up the PU project there. So this is very complicated, Ben, in terms of 4 locations across 2 continents and then racing around the world. Can you see that all working?
I think in some ways it will be a miracle if it does. Some teams struggle to work across 2 locations, and there's so many examples of manufacturer Formula One teams or manufacturer partnered Formula One teams that haven't been able to make that work. Honda with McLaren, they had difficulty. Toyota was famously difficult. And you're just talking about 2 time zones there and 2 locations, 2 offices. Okay, it's only 2 time zones again with this one, US and UK, although I'm not quite sure of the exact geography in the States, whether there's a slight offset. But it just sounds complicated. and overly so. And I just looking at the basic framework, I wonder if this is just a bit too much in terms of trying to get all these different bits to talk together properly and all sing from the same hymn sheet. I don't know what you think, Ed. Having had the tour, maybe you have a bit of better insight into how they're going to manage that.
Well, certainly how they're meant to manage it. Graeme Lowdon says he's tried to model it on the Apollo program, so the NASA program that put 12 men on the moon, and that's all about the communication.
And that was simple,
lines.
Not well complicated at all.
Exactly. Well, he's certainly not saying it makes it easy, but that was a good example of how to. That's all about creating autonomy in the right areas to do what needs to be done. So you've got kind of peer-to-peer communication where it's necessary. So you're not having to throw everything up to the top of a hierarchy and then maybe jumping across to another one and communicating. So that's why if you have mission control, it's I've been to the historic mission control that they have on display in Houston at the Johnson Space Center, and all the desks there are specific different roles. So you have Capcom that does all the capture communication. They even have a media desk. There's flight, etc. And there's communication direct between those as well as through to whoever's in control to the capture. So it's all about streamlining and making it quick and agile. So it's an interesting model. Now, it doesn't mean they'll be sat there in a mission control, but that's what Lowdon's talking about. It's about trying to create as much kind of direct communication as possible to avoid engineering in all these delays. But I'm interested to know what you think, Sahil, about this. Obviously, it's great that this will be an American team that has a genuine American base, because Haas has got Kannapolis, but that's not really doing anything of what you call the F1 race team stuff. There's a bit of admin and that kind of thing there, but it's not really an American-based team, whereas this is an attempt to make it at least a partially US-based team. So that probably gives it a little bit more credibility, as they've called it, an all-American F1 team.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to take anything away from Gene Haas here and what he's built, but the goal here is certainly to have a higher floor than what Haas has, given the enormous backing that they have, given the plans to have its own, GM built power unit after 3 years of using Ferrari. They're going to have that in 2029. I spoke to Peter Carolla about this, one of the team bosses for the new Cadillac team, and he had a line that said something. I wrote it down here. I just want to quote him directly. "I worry about everything, but I'm not concerned about anything just yet." So they're keeping expectations low. I think the balance that I think they're trying to strike, and the balance that I could tell Peter was trying to strike when I spoke to him in Montreal, is trying to get the US fan base jazzed up about this without overpromising. It's such a difficult balancing act, because you want to draw in those fans, you want to garner that interest, you want to break through to that organic American fan base for racing that hasn't really made its way to F1 yet. And I think a team with a brand like GM and Cadillac is certainly a way to do it. But I think the team also understands that the American fan base is quite impatient. And it has very high expectations of American athletes and teams and participation in international sports. And that's one of the things that, if this team does well, it could really create an escape velocity for the US fan base, kind of create the fan base of FOM's dreams in the US, given this priority market. But beyond that, yeah, I think he's trying to balance that with keeping expectations realistic. What he said was they want to create respectable participation early on. In the first test in FP1 in Melbourne next year, that's the word he kept using: respectable participation. They're not putting a number on it. They're not saying we have to be this or that. Also, the fact that it's coming in the midst of a new, with the regulations resetting completely next year, they see that as a positive, because they're the only team that's going to be on the grid next year that never had to build a 2025 car. It could also be a big challenge. I mean, I can think of the bronze Cinderella story, with the regulations and them actually winning that year, but that's certainly not the expectation for Cadillac. So that's the way they're looking at it as they build this team. How do we create excitement, but not too much?
I also don't think that Brawn fairy tale can apply here, because Brawn had an existing team. They took over an operation that was, okay, it underperformed, but everything was there ready to succeed and capitalize on the rule change. It was just that Honda decided to pull out before reaping that reward. To do this as like a complete startup, but also without the shortcuts that Haas took in terms of getting almost a complete car from an established manufacturer plus the engine. It's a massive undertaking. And although the ambitions are great and the idea of trying to live up to that American expectation is laudable, you have to build up from a very low base, and having the expectation management versus that, I think it's going to be really challenging. I mean, already they're saying, that they can't expect to really beat anyone in the first year because of the lag, basically, in terms of understanding. The people they've got on board so far, they don't have people I see as having underpinned big success in this recent rules era. They haven't gone out and signed an Adrian Newey to lead the technical team, for example. Not saying they could have done, but that's the sort of building block you'd need to kind of shortcut the process, maybe. And then you've got this whole lack of knowledge from the most recent rules set, which you might paint as advantage generically in terms of, well, it's a reset for everybody. But I mean, Ed, as you'll know, what the teams have been learning through this most recent cycle from 2022 onwards, some of that the cars don't carry over, but the knowledge does, the data does, the fidelity of the tools and how they're calibrated certainly does. There's still going to be ground effect Formula One cars. So I kind of feel like starting from absolute scratch. I mean, when was the last time a Formula One team starting from absolutely scratch and not buying a car, basically, like Haas did respectably well? It's a long time.
It's such a good point. It's not. I think the other thing that American viewers, American fans should recognize, this is not like an NBA expansion draft. Where you just put a team of 10 to 15 players, you throw 5 players on the court, try to create some chemistry, and win. This is so much more complicated than that.
Yeah, very, very good point. And I think the good thing is they are realistic about it, but the timeline is so long. Now, this team will start racing as a chassis manufacturer before its PU's online. So it's going to be a Ferrari power unit next year. And for the first few years, they've got the GM power unit program that's being built up, and they've got basically permission to come in from 29. But I think that, they haven't said this as such, but I think that will line up with when the next generation power unit is going to be. If it runs on the current schedule, the new one introduced in 26 will run for 5 years. But they might shorten that, and 29 is kind of the first point where you might see a kind of a different engine. So we'll keep an eye on that. But it basically means it's going to be a very long time before what I'd call the completely fully realised version of this team appears, because they're aiming for 600 personnel by the time they have their first race, with another 50 or so to be added fairly quickly. But as they take more of their manufacturing and production in-house, a lot of it to that Fisher's base in the US, that will expand and they'll get up closer long-term to that 1,000 mark. But you're talking a very, very long time just to build up and finish getting everything done and get their buildings complete and so on and so forth. So that I actually think is a positive, because they're not being ridiculously optimistic in terms of what's possible. They're realistic. But yeah, I'm interested in what the external view will be, particularly in the US, where expectations will be high. Well, now we'll hear from Cadillac F1 team principal Graeme Lowdon, who I interviewed up at Silverstone recently. Well, Graeme, it's been a very, very long journey for Cadillac into Formula One. Obviously, people at home won't have heard a huge amount about goings-on beyond the very obvious battle for the entry, but this very much is a team that's not going from a cold start from when the entry was granted, is it?
No, the entry was granted just over 100 days ago, and we need to be racing in Melbourne in just over 250 days or so. So if we had waited, to get just the green light, then it would be impossible to go racing now. Luckily, we started at risk, obviously, because we didn't know what was going to happen with the entry process. But we started building the team 2 or 3 years ago, and there is no other way to do it. And huge credit to GM and to TWG for being prepared to back what was a situation where there was no certainty of entry, and a very, very long, as you say, very long entry process as well. But yeah, that without that head start, we would have absolutely no chance to go racing.
Obviously, a huge amount of design work's been done over a very long period of time. Just been going around the Silverstone facility, which it's kind of part impressive because you can see how much has been done, but also, I don't know, I think if I was in your position, I'd maybe be looking around and thinking, well, this is great, but there is not a lot of time before Melbourne to get a fully functioning F1 team up and running.
Yeah, no, I'm comfortable I'm really comfortable from that point of view, from the timeline point of view. We've got very, very good team of people involved. and I love it. I love walking around here. You know, making Formula One cars is an incredibly creative thing, and I just love seeing the process being carried out. It's some really clever people in the team coming up with some great ideas, and you know, nobody's under any illusion about how difficult Formula One is, and you know, we have huge respect for the other teams, but it was such a sense of relief to end the entry process and be in the you know, the team process. You know, the actual, you know, okay, we don't have a car on the track yet, but as far as I'm concerned, we're racing already, and so you just get, you know, you get that extra energy in your step, and you know, I love walking around and just seeing it and seeing some of the ideas come to life, and you know, both on the wind tunnel model, and you know, we've got our first 2026 chassis in house now, and you know, just watching the testing on that and everything, it's really good to see it all coming together.
Inevitably, everybody wants to know how competitive the car will be. I know you can't answer that because
too.
It's relative, isn't it? But
yeah,
what do you think is credibility for the first season? You must have an idea in mind of, you know, you're not going to be at the front, obviously. I guess it's possible, but that would be beyond miraculous, wouldn't it?
You know, it would be. You know, Formula One is hard, and as I said before, we do have huge respect for you know, for the competition. You know, we know these teams very well, and we know that Formula One's difficult, and it's not a sport where you can come in and beat people. It just doesn't happen. You know, we need to earn our place, but you know, we have three pillars really that the team's built on. You know, we've got General Motors through the Cadillac brand, which brings, you know, huge scale and capability and a history of innovation as well. And TWG with its you know, pure vision of what can be achieved with sport and business acumen as well. And then the team of people who you know, we're putting together, you know, who are all super experienced. You know, the senior management team alone has nearly 700 years of Formula One experience collectively. So bringing all of that together with a fresh energy, and you know, we know that this is going to be difficult, but I think it is important to have ambition, and you know, we have, with those three sort of pillars, we have the ingredients to build, you know, what we hope in time will be a team that fans can be proud to support.
Now, talking about your role and how you're leading this team as team principal, you explained to us a little bit earlier about how complex the whole organisation is, although you've obviously tried to simplify the way it works. You talked about, I think so there's sort of 12 divisions, 12 almost, offices, 12 offices, and you've likened it to the Apollo moon landings, which it's a great line, obviously, in terms of mission controls, etc. But that sounds like a thing that's very easy to say, but quite difficult to execute. So how well is that going, and how fully formed is that as a functioning organisation at this stage?
It's evolving. You know, it's quite a challenge. It's been quite a challenge to build a Formula One team. You know, if somebody just says, you know, here's a Formula One team, here's some resource, just get on with it. And if you built that in a traditional location, that's a challenge. We're doing something different here. This is an American Formula One team. Our head office is in Fishers, in you know, on the outskirts of Indianapolis, and we have operations in Indianapolis, in Charlotte, North Carolina, in Warren, Michigan, with our partners GM, and here at Silverstone as well. So that's not just different locations; it's different countries entirely in different time zones. And so, in looking at, you know, part of my job was to build a management structure that can you know, result in a competitive Formula One team at the end of it. So, you know, so you're right. I looked at, you know, other you know, what I saw as difficult engineering tasks, and you know, there's few things more difficult than sticking a man on the moon. And so it struck me that there's a lot to learn from the structures, the management structures that were used on the Apollo challenge, and a lot of that was generating an environment where there is peer-to-peer interaction. So engineers talking to engineers, and specialists talking to specialists. And that's really what we've tried to do here and replicate. Now, obviously, only time will tell if it works, you know. But hopefully it will. And okay, going racing is different from moon landings, but it's still a highly technical challenge with absolute deadlines, and so as I say, time will tell as to whether that structure's been a success. But so far it seems to be going quite well.
One of the things that was interesting going around the factory, you could see the timelines, the schedule on the design office wall, with all the key dates, and also things like the shutdown. Or on there were 2 shutdowns now, which you're aiming to work to, aren't you? So I thought that was fascinating that you're trying to operate as an active Formula One team before you are, so that you're ready for it next year.
Yes, and we're trying to simulate a lot of things. So we are actually carrying out the shutdowns, even though technically under the regulations we don't need to. For the Barcelona Grand Prix, we simulated the entire Grand Prix race weekend. From Thursday onwards, we did a seat fit in the simulator in Charlotte, and then we had about 50 colleagues between the US and the UK working together on every session. So we mirrored everything that we would normally do over a race weekend, from strategy meetings to reliability meetings. We did every session in the simulator. We looked to improve performance right through the weekend, and we simulated the race as well. And that kind of activity, I think, is really, really important for a new team coming forward. So, all of these things contribute, even in the smallest way. Obviously, doing an exercise like that helps to prove things like the software systems that we're using, but it also helps you get used to hearing people's voices. And what we don't want is to go to Melbourne and feel as if it's the first time we've done anything at all. So there's a lot of simulation and just creative ideas as to how we can be race ready when we get to Melbourne.
How much value is there in your previous experience of bringing a team into Formula One? Because on the one hand, you have come in with Manor, with Virgin as it was initially, but also that was a very different team, very different times, independent operation. This is with huge backing. You've got decent finances behind you. It's a very, very different environment and financial situation, but there must be some quite key lessons that you can carry over, even though this is unrecognisable compared to what you were doing 15 years ago.
Yeah. Understanding the process is one of the key things. Very few people actually understand the entry process itself. So it is useful that I'd been through it before in the past. So that was super helpful. Building any team, irrelevant of the resource that's available, building any team is an incredibly valuable lesson. And I learned so much last time. I worked very closely with John Booth, and still a very, very close friend, and I learned a huge amount from him about just building a team of people, and we're using a lot of what was learned then now. Teams, we've said it before, high performance teams, it starts with people, it ends with people, and the bit in the middle is all about people. And and so a lot of what we learned then is applicable. What is different now is actually it's a much more stable sporting world that we live in now. Back then we were coming in with, there was going to be a cost cap. It was going to be 20 million, then 30, and then 40, and then there was none, and then there was a resource restriction agreement, and then that disappeared. And there was every combination of things that changed at the drop of a hat, and we were up against teams that literally had limitless resources at hand, and I mean limitless. And so things have changed so much now that some of it is actually easier, and some of it can be more challenging. But certainly the lessons learned last time have been invaluable, certainly to me.
And obviously the model of the team in terms of the location, well, the locations, I should say, very much spread out, very, very different model and approach to, say, what Aston Martin have done. I mentioned them because they're a stone throws away from where you are here at Silverstone. And that must create problems that, although you can mitigate them and you can work within them, that is something that could potentially trip this team up at times, the communication, the fact that you're moving items around over longer distances than you would ideally be doing.
Yeah, but I think, what we've tried to do is look for the opportunity everywhere. we don't, for sure we need to recognise where there are challenges and, as you say, mitigate any issues there. And to be honest, that's kind of, we can do that with just good management and good processes. And then, we want to take advantage of this opportunity. We have greater diversity where we're in a position to offer, very different proposition to people who join the team. And we have a much wider catchment as well. So we're getting more diverse team member, a makeup of team members. And that brings diversity of thought, which helps with creativity. And as I said before, this is a creative sport. So, yes, there are some challenges, but we don't want to dwell on the downside of them. We want to really see where the opportunities are and maximise those.
Now, on the driver's side, I'm obliged to ask, because people say, well, why haven't you asked? But I know you don't have driver's sign, but almost that's quite a low profile problem, because you've got a lot to do with building up the team, and it's kind of a buyer's market for driver employment, isn't it? It's not like they're going to be no Formula One drivers available, so you can kind of be patient on that, can't you?
Correct.
It's going to be a position that's filled easily. Yeah,
we're out of sync with the other teams, which kind of makes it easier. It means we can spend a bit more time understanding the attributes that a particular driver can bring and measuring them against what we need. Normally you're in a competitive environment. Sometimes you can't take long to make a decision because someone will go to another team, and when we're not in that position, there's a good list of very, very capable drivers that we can interact with and put a team together with. So we're quite lucky from that one point of view. Another way of looking at it is, because we're out of sync with the other teams, there are certain drivers who probably we would be interested in who might not be available. But as I said, lucky for us, the marketplace is populated with a significant number of very talented drivers that we could choose from.
Obviously, there's a very long way to go before you're even racing, but come the end of 2026, what do you think Formula One fans will think of this team? What would you like to have done to convince them and show them what you're about? Because obviously it's a blank slate to people at the moment, beyond
it is
a little bit of recognition of Cadillac, and obviously the background and the history of the team with obviously Mario Andretti is still on the board, so some big names there.
Yeah, I want it to be a team that people want to join our journey. We don't. I think we'll have a lot to offer fans. We want to engage them with, obviously through social media and through traditional media as well. But we don't want the fans to follow us. We want them to join us, and it doesn't happen very often that a new team comes along. And I think there are so many moments and emotions that we could share with the fans, and if we can do that, we've said before, the biggest asset that the sport has is the fan base. And so if we can contribute to the richness of the offering to the fans, and as I said, bring some fans along so that they join us on this journey, then it's a unique journey. That fans won't get the opportunity to join a new team in its first year very often. So I just hope that we can give the fans a journey to remember.
I guess that journey is a long one, isn't it? Not just in terms of the fact you want to be on the grid for a long time, but we're going to see more and more General Motors involvement through the power unit program down the line. So how's that looking? What's the timeline on that? Is there work going on that project, yes, even though it's quite some way away?
Yeah, there is. So my counterpart, Russ O'Blinas, who runs the PU company, he's also involved in a effectively a huge startup. We'll be racing on the chassis side much earlier than the Cadillac power unit side. That's going to follow later. And we have our relationship with Ferrari. It's a team that I've worked with closely a lot before in the past. And if we look at everything that Russ is doing with the PU company, there's just a huge amount of activity there as well. So we're building factories and hiring people and designing things, and testing things as well. So there's a lot going on in the world of Cadillac Formula One team at the minute.
And finally, it's said, I've said it's almost impossible to build up a startup Formula One team, and that's exactly what you're doing. Made a lot of progress. But have you ever looked at the situation and thought, there's a hell of a lot to get done here, notwithstanding the entry scenario? Is there absolute confidence that the car will be on the grid, you'll be there for testing in late January? It's all on time.
Yeah, absolutely. That side of the challenge, and this is not blasé or underestimating the task. I'm just confident with the people that we've got on board. I've worked with a lot of them in the past. It is a huge job. It's a massive undertaking, but it's achievable. And and then the real difficulty is being competitive, and that's where we'll need to just keep raising the game from our side. We can't affect what happens with other teams, but we can affect all of the things that are within our scope. So success at the end of 2026 for us will be looking back and saying we maximized everything that we possibly could, and then we'll see where it comes out in the wash.
Pretty much summed up the challenge of Formula One there. So thanks very much, Graeme Lowdon.
Thanks, Ed.
Right, really interesting stuff there from Graeme Lowdon, which I hope has given you a bit more insight into how it's working. Now, Sahil, are you as convinced as Lowdon that everything will go as planned? And do you think this team can be remotely competitive? You say it's going to be, respectability, but where is respectability? That's very, very hard to judge. But I'm going to ask you to have a punt.
I believe him when he says they're going to get the cars to testing and to Melbourne and to get the cars on the grid. That does seem like the baseline goal. They have they're putting an enormous amount of effort into that, and they have people who have have been in senior positions at F1 teams before and seem to know what they're doing there. That's not to underestimate the enormity of the task before them, but let's start with that baseline. I believe him on that. Beyond that, I'm very skeptical that they can be meaningfully competitive with other teams, given that I think and Peter mentioned this as well, the shortest running team in F1 is now about a decade, right? They have an enormous disadvantage in terms of muscle memory and in terms of know-how and in terms of adapting to challenges. So certainly I don't think they want to set the expectation that they're going to be last. They're never going to say that out loud. I don't know if they will be. Maybe they'll do better. But I think that I just keep going back to Peter's word, respectable participation. They can define and redefine that on the basis of what they see in the coming months. It does leave them space, and they've given themselves some wiggle room to set expectations accordingly. And then, of course, everyone's paying attention to the driver market as well. I know, Ed, you asked a question about that. He kind of punted. I talked to Peter a little bit, pressed him about the driver situation. I can get into a little bit of what he said if you want to do that now.
Yeah, we can have a little bit of a look at drivers, but maybe before you tell us what he said, let's just have Ben, your view. There's lots of options around. What would you throw in terms of drivers? Who would you go for? People like Bottas, Perez, Joe, Fred Vesti's been mentioned.
I think the two names you mentioned at the start are the right ones to go for. The monumental task that this team has of trying to be just respectably competitive, never mind properly competitive, with all the challenges of the 12 different offices and the flat structure and who's actually accountable for things and this moon landing complicated way of running things, if that starts to go awry, and trying to sort your way through the various things that will just trip you up as a new inexperienced Formula One team, where you don't have this bedrock of experience and, as Sahil says, muscle memory. I think you need the most experienced, competent drivers you can get, because if you plug in a new, raw, let's say IndyCar or American driver for the sort of marketing and jazzing up and hyping up of the team, they're in danger of getting lost and burned in a structure that hasn't established itself, in a team that hasn't quite yet bedded in or understood how it's working. So I think certainly for the start of the project, you need guys like Bottas and Perez. I mean, Perez's reputation damaged at Red Bull, but now increasingly repairing, given how his successors have struggled to live up to the bar set by Max Verstappen. So I think the experience he has from that team, the experience that Bottas built up at Mercedes, very, very valuable for a team like Cadillac. So if I was them, I'd be going for both of those guys if they can get them, and worry about the kind of who's the American driver hero a bit further down the road when you're at the point of respectability and then looking to achieve more.
Yeah, the 12 offices you referenced there is the 12 units it's been kind of divided into for communication. There's not quite as many as 12 different locations, but as I didn't mention a number earlier, it's worth clarifying. Right, that's Ben's version. Sahil, how close is that to what you're being told about what they're going to do?
I think it largely matches. I firstly think it's interesting that the messaging around I think it's interesting that the messaging around the having an American driver on the team has evolved. When it started, when they first launched, I think the word was, and Mario Andretti, who's advising on driver selection, he's not running the team, to be very clear about this, said they were going to have they wanted to have one veteran and one young American talent. That's the phrase he used, including with me in an interview I did shortly after they got approval. And then there were a bunch of questions that Graeme Lowdon got asked in the subsequent months. Some people kept bringing up the Logan Sargent analogy. Are you really going to put an American driver there just for the sake of having one? And I think they started talking about it from the standpoint of it's going to be based on merit. And we've all heard that word many times from the Cadillac team bosses in terms of how they look at this. There's also Graeme had said several months ago, I think in a call with reporters, that there's no reason that they can't have an American driver on merit, but they're just not making that promise anymore, which I think is interesting. Now, in terms of the drivers that Ben mentioned, yeah, it certainly sounds to me like Sergio Perez and Valtteri Bottas are under consideration. I will say several months ago, I strongly got the sense that it would be one of those two, not both of them, because you're looking at pretty similar packages from both of them. Veterans who did very well in midfield cars, maybe couldn't quite convert in top teams because they ran into all-time greats. And they're both in their 30s, so maybe you want someone with a slightly different package. I will also say that I know Sergio Perez's stock has gone up inside the Cadillac ranks since the end of last year, for the same reasons all of us know. He was performing so poorly at the end of last year. People were wondering maybe he's done, maybe he's washed or whatever. That they put Liam Lawson in the car. We saw what happened there. Put Yuki Tsunoda in the car. We've seen what happened. And if you add to that the context of what happened with Pierre Gasly and Alex Albon, it's very clear that second seat, it was a car, it wasn't Perez, and that he may still have some real strength in him to offer. So all of which is to say, I really don't know what they're going to do. I don't think they know. I do think I will say Peter Kola said in Montreal that their short list was at the top end of two hands, and within weeks they wanted to whittle it down to one hand. So it sounds like they are making moves, and they are trying to get serious about that. But they also mentioned that they're a bit out of sync with the rest of the driver market, and the fact that it is a buyer's market, that there's so many more drivers up for grabs than there are spots in teams. That's good for them.
And of course, there is the question of Valtteri Bottas. He's the one who may not be available. Well, Perez as well, because they're both drivers who've had some links to Alpine and some conversations there as well. So it's possible one or both of those may end up, well, one of them, only one can go to Alpine because Gasly's there, but one of those could get taken off the market.
I wouldn't rule it out, Ed, the way that team's going.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, Bottas has kind of moved ahead in the Alpine reckoning recently. So interesting. But yeah, I mean, when Graeme Lowdon says that it's not a top priority for them, I think he is telling the truth, because there's a lot to do in this team. It's interesting walking around the Silverstone base, because it was great to see there's a lot going on, and you can see evidence of stuff, that they've done what they've called a proof of concept chassis. They've done a few chassis, because obviously they're dependent on outside suppliers to build their designs, but they've got a proof of concept chassis that's passed all the FIA crash tests done at Cranfield. Now, those have been passed but not certified by the FIA, and the definitive chassis is yet to come. So they'll have to go through all of that. But they've shown they can do it. There's an aero program that's been running for a long time. Initially, they had a 2025 car aero program. Then in the middle of last year, they went on to the 2026 aero program. They had the advantage of not being limited by the ATR, the aerodynamic testing restrictions that all the other teams are limited by. They only started to be limited by that for the second what's called a reporting period. So up until week 10 of this year, basically, they could do what they wanted, and now they're limited. They're using the Toyota wind tunnel in Cologne. That's the one that McLaren was using until quite recently, and made some pretty good progress with as well. So they've been working on that. So the car model exists. Nick Chester, the technical director, used to be at Renault at Enstone. Pat Simmons, who was working for F1, he's there as an executive engineering advisor, something along those lines. You've got Rob White, who's there as chief operations officer. He's putting together everything there. really experienced, good people, and they've got a full design office. I've walked into the design office, and it's not the biggest you'll ever see, but it's full of people doing a lot of work, and so they're well advanced in terms of the design. So I'm kind of in two minds, because I walk around and think, yeah, this is all good. This is all decent. I've been around a lot of F1 facilities. I've been around F1 facilities before they became F1 facilities. I remember going around the Lotus Racing facility. So that was the one that became Caterham in Norfolk, probably about the middle of the year before they raced. And it was just empty. It had nothing in it. So they're way in advance of that. But part of me thinks, yeah, you've made lots of progress. Part of me thinks there's still a lot to be done. So I'm sort of convinced by it, but it's just so ambitious. This is what we come back to again, isn't it? Just the sheer ambition and the sheer volume of work and knowledge and stuff to be built up.
How does it compare to Aston Martin? Because that's in the same rough location, Silverstone, held up as the new kind of state-of-the-art F1 facility and a big part of attracting someone of Adrian Newey's caliber to that team. So in terms of what infrastructure Cadillac does have right now, is it in the same league?
Oh, it's way behind that. The Aston Martin facility is fully operational. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast, because, I mean, it's different approach as well from Aston, because they've got the full facility, everything pretty much in one building. It's all built up around that. This is a slightly different approach, partly because they are spread across 2 continents. But yeah, in terms of how ready it is, it's still well off that. And that's kind of to be expected. So that there's the logistics hub's got some model making facilities in it, and it's got various things that are in it temporarily while they do other building work and internal building work, etc. So it's a little bit hand to mouth. So it's not perfect and ideal, but and as Graeme Lowdon's admitted, it's not all being done in the ideal order that you would do if you were doing it in an ideal world. But starting an F1 team's tough, so you kind of have to do what you need to do, and it all comes back to that thing of kind of what you were saying, Sahil. What was the phrase? Respectable competition.
Participation.
Respectable participation. Yeah, participation was the word. I think that's what it's about, isn't it? And I guess that's set by making sure you're regularly qualifying for races, so lots of Q1 exits. But yeah, I was just sort of in two minds about how much they've done and being quite impressed, but also thinking still a lot left to do. But having said that, I've got a lot of confidence in what Lowdon and everyone else there are doing. So it's just in that regard, isn't it? It's an amazing project.
And then the second part, the second part of that, they said, Peter mentioned respectable participation as the first goal, and then of course, depending on how things go, they're going to have to worry about reliability. Then they're going to have to try to balance that with performance down the road. So they're thinking about it in a number of tiers. But it does sound, Ed, from what you're saying, that they have the right facilities, that they have the right people at the job. The question is putting it all together. And do you see? I wonder if, from what you guys have seen, do you see any scenario where they don't make it to the grid next year? Like, would everything have to go wrong? Do you think it's within the realm of possibility?
I think they'll be okay. To illustrate their kind of confidence, part of what they're trying to do is build up a lot of the processes and the way things work internally. So they're going to honour the 2-week summer shutdown and the 9-day shutdown that kicks in December. And you wouldn't be planning to do that if you were kind of in a mad panic or running around desperately trying to cobble everything together. So they're kind of confident. So from my perspective, from what I've seen and what I know of those involved, I don't have any particular doubts, unless some complete bolt from the blue derails everything, stopping them from. I think they'll be on the grid. How about you, Ben? You've kind of not seen what I've seen, so you've got a slightly more distant view.
Yeah, I what gives me confidence, or more confidence, compared to, say, the last round of proper startups in the early 2010s, is the playing field, if you like, is different. There's the budget cap in place, so I don't think they're going to be, as well as being properly backed, they're not going to be in a position where suddenly they run short of money, I think, and are scrabbling to get things built, hire people, just get things done. They could get tripped up on things like the crash tests, the sort of things they haven't done before. But I like the fact that they've been going through some of these processes already. And I think, if I'm right in saying it, they've already simulated a full race weekend using a simulator and getting the team around monitors and whatnot. So it feels like they're at a level of preparation that was beyond the last round of startup teams too. So I have kind of broad confidence in that the thing will happen. But the level it will reach and where it will land is the thing I'm not sure about. A lot depends on what Ferrari do with their new engine. And if I think I'm right, they're not considered to be at the top of everyone's list in terms of being ahead on the 26 engines and the 50-50 between electric and ICE. So they won't necessarily gain an advantage from their customer status. That hurts them a little bit. I wonder whether they will have to end up backtracking on this idea of making the team run essentially out of the States. Haas did consider that, having a main American base, and then reverted to basically type and decided that they had to be in the UK as a main base. I don't know if that will play a role once they get into the logistics and some of the challenges. Obviously, there's a big focus on recruiting all American engineers, but I wonder about the talent pool for that when you consider, it's not like the 80s and 90s where IndyCar was a constructors formula and you had more crossover, I felt, in terms of engineering and design to Formula One. It's been mostly spec series at the top end of American motorsport for a long time. So how are you going to get those people assimilated into Formula One? How long is that going to take? And in the meantime, where are they going to recruit these competent people to kind of accelerate the learning process and the progress of the team? I mean, I'm sure they have hired many people who are working in Formula One now, and that will also take some time to drip through, right? So it might be a couple of years before we even see the team as they envisage it now actually in place.
The Ferrari engine for the next couple of years, I think, is quite interesting. It almost makes for a simple one-to-one comparison with Haas. If you think that Haas is also going to have a Ferrari engine, so it just comes down to who's making the better car. Now, of course, if they can get close to Haas, or if they can beat Haas early on, that would be very impressive. I'm not saying they can, but it seems to be a reasonable target for them, right? In the first year or two?
A few years down the line, maybe, perhaps not first year, because they're not doing what Haas is doing, and because Haas basically go as far as they possibly can go in terms of supplied parts from Ferrari. This isn't what Cadillac are doing. They're doing some more of their own and either doing them internally or mostly outsourced at the moment. So I think they are quite a good benchmark. Yeah, you're right in that regard, but maybe that's a thing for sort of year 2, 3 rather than straight away, given how much they've got to catch up on. But it's a useful comparison, and that having that Ferrari engine, you can have the gearbox as well. It's just a useful chunk of the car to not have to worry about initially before you start doing your own elements. But it's a fascinating project because they're at about 67% of the staffing level they say they need for Australia, which is all told 600 people, then with that 50 coming on top of it, kind of beyond that, before they do the further expansion where they take even more of the manufacturing in-house. So there's a lot of people there. I think that's probably the thing that's most noticeable. It's grown quite rapidly because they focused on the design team originally, built that up, and now they're trying to get the race team and all the kit for the race team, all the equipment, etc., etc. And the fact they did that Spanish Grand Prix simulation, and that was a full real-time simulation of the car running in the simulator, they did it like a race weekend in terms of all the timelines and everything. They even notionally had periods for driver media interviews, just so like the engineering staff knew the drivers were not available in this period if they were doing that or other kind of commercial stuff, etc. So they're trying to do that, and that also means they've got enough people to do it in terms of kind of simulating operations trackside and operations back at base as well, because everybody's got race support. So that probably gives an idea of where it's at now. And it wasn't that long ago that this was just a team that designed a car, and that was a lot more to be thrown in there. So it's going to change a lot in the coming months. But yeah, I can't help but think there'll be probably moments where Graeme Lowdon's looking at thinking, there's a lot to be done here. But he's a very good person to have in charge of it. And I have to say, Sahil, I think he was quite an important recruit overall. Like I said, he got that Andretti push kind of on an even keel, got it all to quieten down, understood that the game, how the game is played in the F1 paddock, in which you have to get F1 on side, and they lost a lot of ground in that. And I think, along with all the legal stuff, Loudon's played an important part, in making sure that they got the entry as quickly as they could, and also just answering that question of, right, how do we actually build up this team? Which is a question he said they asked him because he came in as a consultant, and they said, right, how do we do it? And he's like, well, okay, I need to think about that to come up with the plan. He said, right, do you want to do it for us? And suddenly he's team principal. So big in that regard. So what do you think of Lowdon?
I don't have an excellent sense of him. I think you guys would have a better insight into his past and what he's done before. But I do think as just based on what you said, the fact that they tapped him first in that role and then made him team principal, they see something strong in what he's saying and what he's doing. I think he is, like I said, been careful to set expectations correctly and to try to remind people at every opportunity just how difficult this task is going to be, just all the things that they have to get done. And I like the fact that they're not rushing too much on the driver selection process, that they're taking their time, that they don't want this to be the entire conversation, even though that's kind of the spiciest thing that most people want to hear. But he seems very even keeled as well, in the way he's approaching all of this, which is certainly something they need.
Yeah, and he's something you know as well of old, Ben, isn't it? Through the work he did with the Virgin / Mauritius / Manor team. He was obviously one of the founders along with John Booth there, and although they both left kind of the year before it had its final season. But he's a sharp operator, isn't he?
Yeah, and he worked well in a very difficult circumstance, and that ended up being one of the better performing, doomed new teams from the last round, if you like. So that's credit to both of them, actually, that they managed to eke it out for that long. Obviously, he's maintained a presence in Formula One too. He has, established relationships with stakeholders. He knows Ferrari a bit. He's been doing some driver management on the side with Zhou Guanyu. So I think they probably recognised that they needed a presence who just knew how Formula One worked and had some existing relationships that he could leverage. And you can see with the way the team's kind of been built up with some of those names you mentioned earlier, Ed, that it's people who maybe don't all have absolutely up to the minute recent experience of F1, but enough within the last decade that you could say, well, that gives us a kind of running start. And you probably need to accept a certain Eurocentric, Brit-centric element in the beginning just to kind of shortcut the ridiculous process of getting up and running and knowing how everything works. I wonder from your tour, actually, how much of what you saw in terms of the personnel already working there felt familiar to you in terms of it looks like a recognisable Formula One team, and how much of it was actually just brand new faces, a completely new perspective.
Yeah, the design office was probably the one that was the most familiar because it just looked like a design office, and yeah, there's some familiar faces in there as well. So that's the bit that kind of needs to be the most advanced. That's positive in that regard, and they've done a lot of stuff as well. So there's some significant landmarks in terms of developing bits of the car, etc. They're going to sign off the testing aero package in November, middle of November, for test in January. So,
and that's nice and advanced, right? So again, this gives you confidence that that earlier question of about could this actually just fall through? It sounds like they have really got their ducks in a row in terms of like having enough timeline. Even though the whole thing has been a bit frantic and compressed overall, to get just the basic things done.
Yeah, this is not US
the Joe
F1.
Connection is also interesting, right?
Yeah, I mean,
the Joe Connection that Ben mentioned, and whether it's a one of the main drivers, whether it's a reserve driver, although I have no insight as to whether that's a real possibility or whether he would even want to do that. But the fact that he is driven, that he is now connected to Ferrari and knows that engine well, that seems to have some value. And also, if you're thinking about Cadillac and the commercial side and the market, I mean, the fact that he has obviously a fan base in China is going to be seen as attractive commercially to Cadillac and its shareholders, given the potential, I guess, to reach that enormous market.
Yeah, and he's a good safe pair of hands, Joe. He's probably better in race conditions than in qualifying, although we did see a few good qualifying performances kind of at times as well. Struggled a bit last season. So Joe, I think, is a guy who's got a reasonable chance there. And yeah, all those connections help him. And obviously, yeah, Lowdon is involved with his management, and that's not particularly unusual now. There's a lot of team bosses who've got some kind of driver management involvement. So we'll see how that plays out. And he's not going to be the one who's the sole decision maker on this either as well. So yeah, interesting to see how that plays out. I'd say there's a good chance we'll see him in some role in that team, and a chance it could be race driver, although that's a smaller chance than the confidence he'll have some kind of role. But it's still all to be played out, I think. But it's worth just in the kind of final reflections, Sahil. This team ultimately, it's not going to be USF1, which was the great American team hope that sort of collapsed before the season. They've done way more than that, so that's positive from that regard. But overall, we've talked about the kind of expectations there might be, but actually having something that's recognisably a US F1 team in the lowercase sense rather than the proper noun sense as USF1 was, but a proper American team. They brand it as All American, even though there's going to be a big base in the UK as well. That could be, on a long enough timeline, a pretty big deal. If in 2035 or something, you've got a Cadillac driver winning the world championship, GM branding and all that kind of thing, that would be a huge deal for F1 in the US, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the potential here is massive. The upside potential if this does go well. I think one of the things that F1 is still missing, and has been missing for a while, even in the midst of all this amazing growth that we've seen here in the last 5 or 6 years, is an American driver who can compete for points, even let alone podiums or wins down the road. A recognizable American team with a brand that people generally recognize, a car that people are going to say, "Hey, I want to go buy that car." The same way that the same way that I think happens in Europe with all of the teams there, and I think the connection that the fan base has. So the potential is certainly there. Not just for Americans, but I think FOM sees this. Liberty Media certainly sees this. See the potential down the road for this to be a big deal. But again, you have to set expectations correctly, because you don't want to raise the bar so high and to make people think that this team is going to be immediately competing for podiums and wins. And that's just such a difficult balance to strike, because you want to draw them in, but you also want them to get acquainted with F1 in the same way that a ton of American fans have, despite the fact that we haven't had an American driver there for a while. So it's not the be all and the end all, but I think it unlocks something special if that were to be a possibility, if that were to happen down the road.
Yeah, and of course, huge potential in terms of that Cadillac brand. They've chosen that for a reason. Cadillac as a brand, certainly in the UK, it's non-existent basically. So they're going from a low starting point. So they'll hope to make progress with that as well. So it's one of those things, isn't it? There's a load of potential there, but it's amazing how quickly it's gone from being this long, far off, distant thing to suddenly we're basically 6 months away from it having to be ready to run in testing. So it's going to be a fascinating story to follow. So thanks very much, Ben, and thanks in particular to you, Sahil. Great to have you on, and hopefully we'll be able to have you on for another appearance at some point in the future. So thanks very much.
Pleasure. Great to join you.
And of course, we've got the British Grand Prix coming up, so stay with us for everything you need to know for the world of Formula One.